Hello and welcome back to Protect Life. Here we are, breaking the consensus. I'd like to thank you out there for joining us today. Today I'm delighted to be talking to well-known journalist, commentator David Quinn. Before we start into our conversation today, I'd like to first of all ask you if you could see the subscribe button, click on that so you'll be notified of any new material that we have. Also, in these difficult times, we have lots of campaigns we need to work on and things we need to do, and we need your help. So the donate button is there. Anything you can give will be really appreciated, and we do our best to use it as wisely as well as we possibly can. But David, thank you on this glorious day. I know you've been rushed across country from Roscommon to be with us, and I really want to thank you. I appreciate you taking the time out to join us today.
Sure.
So David, would you want to talk about this rather, I think, to the outside observer, strange state of affairs regarding the Gino Kelly self-styled Dying with Dignity bill? So could you fill in a bit of the history of where this comes from? It's Gino Kelly sponsoring the bill, but I think it started originally with John Halligan. So what are we talking about here?
Well, as you say, it began with John Halligan, who's now retired. The bill to allow assisted suicide / euthanasia, or as they like to call it, dying with dignity, was cooked up between John Halligan and Tom Curran. And Tom Curran, it belongs to Exit International, which I think is originally Australia-based. This guy, Philip Nietzsche, in Australia is the founder, and long-time campaigner for assisted suicide, and let it be added, not just for the terminally ill or even the seriously ill. Exit International's aim is that anybody who can make quote unquote a rational choice should be allowed to avail of assisted suicide, because they're completely radically pro-choice on the issue. So it's kind of taking the logic from the abortion issue, no limits, and putting it over into the assisted suicide / euthanasia issue, no limits. So if you can make a rational choice, you should be permitted to end your life, and with the help of somebody else if you need to. And it doesn't have to be with the help of somebody else. You just get drugs that will definitely do the job and do it successfully and do it painlessly. So that's what they're all about. So anyway, Tom Curran and John Halligan.
David, yeah. Tom Curran. Halligan was a member of the Oireachtas. Who was Tom Curran?
Tom Curran, as I say, Exit International, a member of that.
Right.
And also he is, his wife or partner, Mary Fleming, tragically had MS.
Right.
And the two of them were campaigners for her, right, as they would see it, to avail of assisted suicide, when the time came, in their view. And, the two of them would have been high-profile campaigners. Now, Mary Fleming has since passed away, but the campaign goes on. Okay. So that's who Tom is. I've debated him a few times. Nice man. But obviously I'd be diametrically opposed to what he wants here. And again, it's not just with the terminally ill, because he's an Exit International. It goes way beyond terminally or seriously ill in terms of their aims. So that's how the bill originated. John Halligan retires. There have been attempts before to get it before the Dáil and never went too far. So John Halligan leaves and looks around for somebody to become the new sponsor of the bill. And he alights on Gino Kenny, People Before Profit. And Gino says, sure, I'll do it. And so basically takes over the bill and he puts it back before the Oireachtas, and it reaches first stage. And at first stage, there's a vote to get to the second stage, I think it's committee stage. And there was a majority vote in favour of doing so. It's kind of worrying. It was a free vote, but you see people like Justice Minister Helen McEntee voting in favour. You see people like Health Minister Stephen Donnelly voting in favour. You see Tánaiste Leo Varadkar voting in favour. New Fine Gael TD Jennifer Carroll McNeil votes in favour. And you look down this list, and it's kind of worrying. Now, it didn't get to second stage by a large vote. I think it was maybe by 8 or 10 votes that it went through to committee stage. There was people on the other side who voted against, who slightly surprised me. Josepha Madigan, who was the Fine Gael, campaign chief for repealed the 3 years ago. She voted against. Charlie Flanagan voted against, and I think Richard Bruton voted against. So there's a few somewhat surprising names, and kind of good to see them voting against this bill.
So at the time, I think I'm right in saying that there was quite a bit of disquiet, shall we say, outside of the substantive issue that was being addressed in the bill, but regarding the framing of the bill as it stood in the language, that legally speaking, it was very problematic. Is essentially that's what's been the problem when it gets to committee?
Well, I mean, let's describe the bill itself. So the bill only comes to maybe a dozen pages. So it's almost the back of the envelope kind of exercise. And I suspect the main purpose of the bill was to get the thing in front of the Oireachtas and kind of push them into discussing it and considering it more. So the bill was to allow only for the termination of the terminally ill after seeing 2 doctors and after being diagnosed as terminally ill. But terminally ill in the bill simply meant likely to die. So what does that mean? 51% likely?
Mm-hmm.
It didn't say how near to death you had to be. So you could potentially be diagnosed today as likely to die from whatever you've got. And you go to see 2 doctors, and 2 weeks later, you can avail of assisted suicide. And you could be years away from actually dying, and likely to die, so you mightn't die, actually. So it was an incredibly loosely worded bill. I debated it with Gino Kenny, and Gino Kenny was kind of saying, it talks about, people who are unbearably suffering. And I said, it doesn't mention the words unbearably suffering. He said, yes, it does. I said, no, it doesn't. And it doesn't. So it's kind of amazing to be, debating a guy who's the sponsor of the bill and didn't seem to have read his own bill or understand it. And he also seemed to think that, no, you have to be in a certain period of death. I said, no, you don't. I said, there's no stipulation at all. And then we had media, reporting, there's all kinds of really tight safeguards. No, there's not. Because they just were in favour of it. So there was no scrutiny done of the bill, and nobody reporting on it seemed to actually read the bloody thing. It's just something they want. And so they just kind of wave their hands in the air and say, there's all kinds of safeguards and unbearable pain and suffering, and don't actually read the thing. See, no, it doesn't mention any of this, actually. So this incredibly sloppily worded bill, it goes before the Oireachtas, and they voted the second stage. I mean, it's a scandal. It really is a scandal. It shows just the completely intellectually and morally unserious nature of Irish politics today. That such a piece of doggerel should have gotten the second stage at all. I mean, Victoria in Australia passed a bill a couple of years ago in favour of all this, but it's something like 100 pages long. So at least it's a serious piece of legislation. I mean, I'd obviously be against it anyway, but this thing was just awesomely sloppy. I mean,
as you say, it seems like a fairly unserious piece of politics to happen in the country's parliament. But outside of parliament, bar honourable exceptions like yourself, I heard you debate Gino Kenny, and it seemed to me, listening on, that the man didn't show a whole lot of evidence of having read his own bill.
No.
But yourself and a couple of other honourable exceptions, there was almost no serious critical textual analysis or criticism in any of the media about the bill. I wasn't reading very many detailed analytical pieces by law correspondents or professors of law about it. It was just, this is a compassionate thing that we need to do, and we just need to get on and do it.
No, the bill was nearly a detail, and what's in the bill was just a detail, and it's the principle is what matters to them. Mm-hmm. And so the important thing is to move along the agenda. And I mean, Gino Kenny himself was saying, well, if you want to redraft it or improve it here and there, that's fine. So I think the main aim was simply to move the agenda forward. I think those who drafted it can't have, in their own minds thought this would be anything like the final form. And I suppose when you think about it, if you go back to John Halligan, private member, it's pretty hard to put together a really comprehensive bill because it takes a lot of skill to do that kind of thing. And that's why you've got teams of people behind the scenes in places like the Department of Justice or whatever is producing, bills of various types. And it's hard, skillful work. And so like a bill of a dozen pages is simply intended, as I say, to get the thing to the launch pad. And they got it a bit further than the launch pad. But as you say, there was no proper scrutiny of it in the media. Gino Kenny didn't have to go through any kind of exacted interviews that I ever heard about the bill. You haven't got, that I ever heard, commentators and presenters saying, well, you know, Gino, your bill says this, this, and this, and it doesn't say these other things. So there's none of that kind of scrutiny. It's just absolutely amazing to me, or not amazing when you think about it, when what really matters is pushing forward the agenda. But I mean, I'm just thinking, like, if any of us on our side came up with a sloppy piece of work, our reputations wouldn't survive. And if I came up with something and then went on a program, didn't seem to have read what I was putting out there, you know, I'm not sure that I wouldn't, you know, be slightly laughed at.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So do you think that ultimately the real purpose here, the real purpose going on here is actually simply, it's like to rise the hair?
Yeah, I think so. So the thing reached committee stage, was the Justice Committee, and they had a private hearing there a week or two ago, and they basically killed the bill, but they didn't kill the issue, no pun intended. They moved to the special committee, and at least didn't move it to a citizens' assembly, which to my mind would have been even worse. But the thing hasn't gone away. I suppose what was gratifying, like the Justice Committee invited all kinds of people to make submissions, and a lot of doctors did so. Nearly all the doctors are against it. So at least the Justice Committee would have registered widespread medical objection to it.
So I wanted to ask you about that, as regards both doctors individually, but also the various medical associations. What is the position here of the associations on the subject?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no major doctors' body in favour at all. All the ones who declared are against. Obviously, you know, the palliative care and hospice movement are against. The Royal College of Psychiatrists, I hope I have the name right, against. The Royal College of Physicians, again, I hope I have the name right, but I'm not too far off the mark, against. A group of doctors have got together specially to come out in favour of it, led by a GP named Brendan O'Shea, who's former head of the Irish College of General Practitioners. So I think there's maybe a dozen or 20 doctors who are in it, but it's the only body of doctors that has so far come out in favour. And all the major, let's say, doctors' bodies against. Now, of course, if we cast our minds back to the abortion referendum, various of these doctors' bodies were in favour of repealing the 8th.
Yes.
So I hope that eventually they won't all be knocked over like Skittles.
There seems to be a more serious and deeper resistance on this subject, though, within the professional bodies. Is that your sense?
Yes. I mean, again, if you go back a sufficient number of years, there was serious moral resistance from within the medical profession to abortion. And then bit by bit, the kind of whole ideology of choice began to kind of, you know, penetrate and permeate and take over. And then the right people move into the right positions, and they began to kind of shift, you know, these bodies in the desired direction. So I'd be fearful something similar would happen, although it would take a fair number of years now, I'd say, to shift them over towards a pro-euthanasia position. One of the big medical bodies in Britain had been against it, and then moved to a position of neutrality. And then I think what happened there was the position of neutrality was somehow mysteriously considered to be in favour, because if you're not against it, you must be for it. And so you see this kind of jiggery pokery going on in some of these bodies, and you know, something of the same type won't happen here, but nonetheless gratifying to see it. And I think, you know, if you're a GP and you're thinking in years to come, here I am with my long-standing patient, and they're seriously ill, and then suddenly one day they say, in an, you know, sort of in an environment where we got assisted suicide, doctor, I wouldn't mind availing of this. And then the doctor is kind of thinking, well, what do I do here? Like, because I'm not in favor of this, and I don't even want to be asked. And they just think it kind of alters the doctor-patient relationship. And suddenly you're looking at your doctor as somebody who will help you to commit suicide. And that's a pretty major change.
Sorry, David, I know this isn't your proposal or your bill and you're not sympathetic, but for the purpose of clarity, what do they mean when they say assisted? I mean, what is the nature of this type of suicide, this act? What will this actually look like in practice?
Well, I mean, you can't kill yourself because of some physical infirmity or mental infirmity. So somebody has to do it for you. You can ask for it. In fact, you have to ask for it because otherwise it's obviously non-consensual. So it could be somebody with one of these horrible degenerative diseases, and they get to a point where their physical incapacity becomes such that they can't kill themselves, so they need to be injected by somebody else or receive some kind of lethal gas. But it was a case in the Netherlands of a demented woman, getting a lethal injection. She had left one of these advancce directives, and she said, when my dementia becomes sufficiently bad, I want my life to be terminated. And so the time came, and the doctor said, well, I think it's reached that point, and they consulted with the family, and the family said, we agree. And so the family was there when this happened, and she began to fight back. And they said, well, that's not really an act of the will. That's just her, she'd be resisting getting food, maybe because of her demented state. And so the family had to hold her down while she receives a lethal injection that killed her. And this got investigated by the Dutch authorities just to see if they'd broken any rules or law. And the court decided, no, they haven't. So that's what it looks like. And remember, here we got somebody in the case of dementia who actually is not suffering from what we would traditionally call a terminal physical illness.
Yes.
Although dementia, apparently by one reckon, is one of the biggest killers there is, because it eventually does kill you or you die with it. So like, go back to the Gino Kenny bill, dementia could have been the terminal illness you're likely to die from. And a person can have dementia for a very long time.
But what you're describing, it seems to me, isn't actually what I think the phrase assisted suicide conjures up. You're effective, and what it is voluntary homicide. I'm agreeing to allow you to kill me, but ultimately it will be the doctor or the other person who actually does the killing. It's not going to be an act of suicide. It's an act of permitted murder. I'm saying,
yeah.
And how does that? Surely, if you're a doctor, a GP, and somebody comes into you, and they're saying, well, I think this is. I'm sorry, I've reached the point. Surely this must change fundamentally the dynamic of how doctors see themselves and their role, and how we see the role of medicine and doctors.
Yeah, because abortion already changed what doctors can and can't do, didn't it? Because suddenly a doctor can facilitate or directly end a human life, but it's never been part of medicine, so it's already become part of medicine. I suppose the pro-choice doctors would argue, well, we're putting the needs of one patient ahead of the needs of the other, and so therefore we're going to facilitate the termination of the unborn life. Here we've got the patient directly in front of you. There's no other patient. And again, it could be a patient you've had a relationship with for years, and suddenly now you could be that patient's killer, albeit with their permission. So it's a whole kind of different ball game, but it's probably why a lot of the medical profession is balking at the idea of it. But just to go back a minute, to the Netherlands and Belgium and some of these other countries. Whenever there was one of these hard abortion cases here, like the C case or the X case or whatever, which are genuinely difficult cases, or this would be to have a Panavar one, the whole world pays attention, and they say, look at Ireland's horrible abortion law, the horrible inhuman things it results in. But who here knew that a family held down their mother while she receives a lethal injection?
Yes.
Who knows that children are now getting euthanized in these countries? Nobody knows any of this. Nobody knows that the slippery slope isn't so much a slope as a sheer cliff face, in that terminal illness, and then physical illness, and then mental illness, and then to children, and then a push. You just have to be tired of life, because it's either the Dutch health minister or justice minister is proposing that anybody over the age of 70 can decide my life is completed. So there's nothing at all wrong with them, nothing, and they can avail of it too. And none of this causes the kind of horror it ought to cause, unlike our law, which caused widespread consternation again and again and again. So euthanasia never does this, never causes international outcry.
You mentioned mental illness as the cascade effect, and there was a case, I think it was in Belgium, where a young man who was suffering from depression applied to be killed on the basis that he was depressed, and there was no apparent treatment that he felt could be successful to treat his depression. He was considered to be a suitable character. Now, leaving aside, how do they respond to concerns that on one side, for many years now, we have a massive amount of discussion, and it seems dozens and dozens of charities and organizations dedicated to what is perceived as being a crisis in suicide across the country. And we keep telling people, you know, suicide is not the answer. That the professionals in the area say that suicide is never a rational act in itself. It cannot be a rational act. How can you distinguish at one stage and say, well, we're absolutely resolutely opposed to suicide. We're doing everything we can to reduce suicides, and we want people to reach out and get help. And then we're apparently going to institute a system where, okay, you can't commit suicide, but we'll arrange it for you.
Well, you know, when I've debated this sort of thing and raised these kind of points, what's put back to me is, oh, no comparison, and you're scaremongering, and the kind of the kind of suicide we're against is irrational, but this other type we're in favor of is rational, because the person has decided that they're in unbearable pain. And then you point out, well, the person who kills themselves also obviously feels they're in unbearable pain, and you're making these incredibly subjective judgments about it. So I mean, it is very hard to see how you can maintain the distinction with a big red line between the two of them, because obviously, subjectively speaking, both people are feeling in unbearable pain, but one gets the help of a doctor maybe and the other one doesn't. And society is maybe judging that in the case of this young person, well, you've got so much of your life ahead of you, but they're thinking, no, because I'm suffering chronic depression and always will, and I'm just not prepared to put up with this. But as we've seen in some of these other countries, they do think, people like that are candidates for it. So, good luck maintaining the big bright red line between these two things. It just seems to me it becomes harder and harder to do. And also when it comes to suicide, various suicide awareness charities will say there's a copycat effect here, which media have really got to be careful not to trigger. And so when you're reporting suicide of a particular person, you can't do it in such a way as to make the reader think that's like me and to kind of sympathize.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking, well, okay, well, that looks like it might be an acceptable thing for me too, because look at this very sympathetic coverage of the plight of this person. So this is, these particular anti-suicide bodies stipulate don't cover it this way. But on the other hand, when it comes to assisted suicide, it's covered in a way, yes, we completely understand why you would want to avail of assisted suicide. And then anybody at home with a similar condition is thinking, all right, what's this telling me? It's telling me that my life isn't worth living anymore. And how do you not send that signal? It's absolutely impossible not to send it. So a particular person suffering this condition and a really sympathetic interview as to why they want to end their lives, how does the person at home listening to this in a similar condition not hear the message, it's okay for you to kill yourself? We understand why you think your life isn't worth living anymore. It's impossible not to do it.
Also, how do you avoid that sense that we know that many people, particularly when they're ill, and especially if their illness is chronic or they're very elderly, may at times feel guilty, or they may feel like a burden, or they may feel that their life is creating a difficulty for other people. And it's not necessarily that they find their lives unbearable or they're in terrible pain, but that if you create a culture where you regard that this is a reasonable reaction, that how can we sensibly pretend that this isn't going to create a culture where pressure is going to come on people, that the economics of this is going to play a part? I mean, do you remember there was that bizarre case in the state in the United States where a person was ill and the state, shall we say, the state insurers, the state health system, was unwilling to support the payment of a particular kind of drug because it was very expensive. But they did say they would be happy to pay for their assisted suicide.
Yeah, I mean, what an act of charity that is. And there's a fellow in Canada, and he'd be a relatively young man, but he has been diagnosed with one of these, again, awful degenerative illnesses. And so he's been acquainted with his options by his medical team, and the medical team puts assisted suicide as one of them in front of him. And you see, if you do get into a situation where assisted suicide or euthanasia are permitted, then when you're diagnosed with something awful, is the doctor obliged to tell you, here's one of your options? All right, because you have a right to it, apparently, now, if we were to move into that scenario, under law. And so wouldn't doctors then be routinely telling these people, here's one of your options? And they're thinking, really? I mean, is my life now that worthless? This is one of my options. So, I mean, I just don't see how you don't change the entire conversation that doctors will be having with patients who have these terrible conditions.
Okay, if I'm aware of the time, I want to finish up with possibly, I'm going to invite you to possibly be a little bit optimistic on this. And I'm going to put two things to you. The first is, as you said before, we saw a number of people who, in the first reading of the bill, voted against it, and that we would perceive as being normally from the progressive, what's called the progressive wing of Irish politics. I saw a quote on social media from Charlie Flanagan, and Charlie, I think, would certainly be perceived as the progressive wing Fine Gael, when he said, I think the quote was, "I'm implacably opposed to this so-called dying with dignity bill. I hope I'm not alone." So that kind of language, I think, certainly surprised me, gave me pause for thought. But also, on the other hand, it would be wrong to suggest, wouldn't it, that there is some kind of just universal agreement within progressives, within the developed world, about this issue. While places like the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of the United States, parts of Australia have gone down this road. Other jurisdictions have been asked recently and have rejected it in part strongly. If we look at the example in the United Kingdom, with a very it goes to the Parliament. It was debated long and hard, and with a substantial majority, the Parliament, on a free vote, rejected an assisted suicide or euthanasia bill. So this isn't maybe like some of the fights we've been fighting before, where all of the currents seem to be running in one direction. Or am I being excessively optimistic there?
I think probably a bit, to be honest. I mean, one thing that did surprise me a few years ago was the Scottish Assembly voted against. Now, the Scottish Assembly, I think Scotland suffers the same Celtic inferiority complex we do, and therefore overcompensates by being just massively modern. All right. So I think we're a bit similar when it comes to that. But the fact that they voted against was a source of encouragement. I would be a little more optimistic that this can be, okay, so it goes to special committee. The special committee will come out and maybe recommend it in some form, unless the doctors can really put together a good campaign. And then it goes for a free vote in the Dáil, and it'll probably be nip and tuck. But again, if these doctors, and so also some of these disability rights groups, can get to enough of these TDs, I think it could be defeated maybe the first and second time, and then they, keep moving forward and softening up public opinion. I mean, the pro-choice argument is incredibly strong, and in debates I've done at university, for example, about this, they accept it's not that different to suicide, what we deplore as suicide, and they can see it is kind of similar, and they do see the slippery slope. And they do see that someday you could be put under pressure. So where's your choice if you're being put under pressure? And they still vote for it in the name of choice. Okay? So it's like it just causes their brain to just fuse completely. I want this someday for me, even though you might be coming under pressure. And so it's not really a choice at all. Because, I mean, the older I've got, the more it occurs to me, actually, you think you're making a choice, but you're really following norms. Okay? And norms are what kind of dictate your life. And all these various social pressures that create norms. That's really what's going on. You're not making a choice at all, you're following the norm. And then the norm moves progressively towards assisted suicide. And this is what you do when you reach a certain point in your life, even if you don't really want to. And still, you see them in favor of it. And New Zealand had a referendum less than 2 years ago about this, and nearly all the doctors were against it. And the people voted in favour by 2-1 because of choice, the sacred value. Even when you're trying to demonstrate, you're probably not really making a choice.
And also, is it perhaps, well, as long as I get to make my choice, I don't really care how it impacts on anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes in these debates, somebody will say something like, you know, we don't let dogs suffer, and we bring a dog to the vet, and we're treating humans worse than that because we're leaving them in pain. Of course, palliative care doctors say, well, we can manage pain in nearly every single case nowadays. But my response to the thing about we don't even treat dogs this way is, no, hang on a minute. When you put down a dog, it sends no signal to dog society that this is an acceptable way to end your life.
Yeah.
All right. So we're not like dogs because we can see when this person is allowed to avail of suicide and my condition is similar, is telling me that actually my life mightn't be worth living. But when you put down dog A, it doesn't tell dog B, your life, dog B, isn't worth living. So it's completely different. And it's amazing people can't see such a crucial difference.
Okay, last question for our, direct to our viewers or listeners, who obviously many of them are very concerned about this. And if you were talking to somebody and who asked you for a piece of advice, what can I do? Is there anything I can do to try and in some way affect this debate or this discourse?
Well, I mean, absolutely. They've got to get onto their TDs. And they've got to say, don't vote for this. Look at what the doctors are saying. Look at what the disability rights groups are saying. TDs have got to know if you go down this course, you will lose votes. You see, I think it's one of these issues where opinion polls are showing the majority in favor. But probably within the minority against, they're probably more inclined to switch their votes. All right, because you don't yet see the passion in favor that there was in favor of abortion during the abortion referendum and same-sex marriage during that referendum. So you don't see the same kind of grassroots activist energy. So I suspect there'll be more grassroots activist energy on our side, and therefore TD might be registering this, okay, people who really, really care about this tend to be more pro-life. And therefore, I might lose votes here.
Okay, listen, that's all I can, I think you take your words, I'd say to the people out there, go talk to your TD, go down to their clinic, send them a letter, certainly if you want, give them a ring, but I think go down in person, talk to them, talk to your county councillors. Always be polite, always be nice, be gentle about it. It's no use being angry, it's counterproductive. If you're involved in voluntary organisations that are involved, say, in disability rights, anything like that, try and channel through those organisations. Maybe even talk to your doctor, see what their position is and see if they have been involved in the debate. Anyway, thank you very much, David Quinn,
okay, thank
from
you.
the Sunday Times and the Iona Institute and all over and everywhere. Please God, we'll be talking again sometime. I'd like to thank you, viewers, for watching today. And again, I'd urge you to click the button. Anything you can do to help would be greatly appreciated to help promote those life causes and values that we all share. Thank you and stay safe.